Hey there, I'm your imaginary friend, and today I have for you a story by Irvin S. Cobb. Now, I usually try to preface these with a little bit of a warning that sometimes an author may have included things that at the time of writing seemed fine to them, and they're not always fine. That's kind of just a courtesy because sometimes these things sort of leap out at you, and if you're not prepared, they can be a little startling. Now, in this particular case, I feel like as a friend, whether it's imaginary or otherwise, I would be remiss if I read you this story without bracing you a little bit extra ahead of time. If you are not in the kind of headspace where you can absorb um, overt racism very plainly stated, then maybe put this off until you're in a different headspace. Now, if anybody's interested in a discussion of this work and its author in their historical context and the uh, process of deciding whether or not to actually read this on a public forum, um, please write in the comments if you have any particular questions about it. Please do feel free, and I will try to see what I can put myself together if there's interest in it. This is the Unbroken Chain. In the year 1819, a string of 21 black slaves was passing along an African game trail bound for Mombasa. In this connection, the word string advisedly is used. These 21 blacks were hitched in a tether, one after another like a mess of fish on a stringer. Only in the case of the fish, the cord would have been threaded through the gills. This lot were yoked together. They were chained neck by neck. Each one of them wore an iron collar clamped on. A 4-foot length of iron chain springing from this collar in front teamed him with the fellow going before him. A similar chain joined him fast to the slave following next in order. This left the legs free for the march and his hands for carrying a burden, if one were given to him to carry, or for scratching himself or for beating himself on the breast in lamentation of his captivity, yet in all respects held him well secured. If there were any places of favor, they belonged to the pair who traveled at the far ends of the leash. The file leader had no chain dragging him under his chin, but only a chain at his back. The one at the extreme rear, likewise, had to support just half the burden of metal which each of the 19 intermediaries bore. The gang lived and ate and slept in their chain. At night time they lay down in a ring, their feet pointing to a common focus where a fire burned to keep off the leopards and the lions. By day they moved along to the accompaniment of a constant grating and clanking, each using his free hand, if he had one, to ease the pressure of the neck ring upon the base of his throat, or where its rivets irked the top jointings of his chine behind. They were all adult males, and therefore, in the eyes of their present proprietors, rather more to be prized than the run of a mixed assortment would have been. They were members of a tribe living well back in the country, in the foothills of the mountains. Their tribal mark was the filing of their upper front teeth to sharp points. They had been taken in a night raid of the valorous Maasai. Formerly, they would have been massacred on the spot by the light of the blazing huts, or reserved for sacrificial torture on the return of the victims to their own village. But lately the Maasai had found a more profitable, if less congenial, way for disposing of all able-bodied prisoners. Now they bound them and brought them out to a place called Kilwa, and lodged them in a barracoon. To this place the Arabs came up from the sea, and once in a while the Portuguese, and these exporters bargained with the Maasai for their human spoils, and carried them away. On this side of Africa the trade had not attained the proportions which made the trade on the Guinea coast so enormously profitable. Indeed, on the Indian Ocean the traffic never amounted to a fifth of what it did where the Congo ran down to the Atlantic. But at this time it was growing fast, thanks to a steadily rising market and a steady demand for prime and prize offerings in certain parts of the world, notably Persia and Turkey in the east, and Cuba, Brazil, and the more southerly states of the new North American Republic on the other side of the world. This especial group of slaves was in herd to 6 Arabs, who bore weapons for defense and heavy hippo pelt whips for disciplining their purchases. If the sub-chief who strode on ahead to set the pace wished to halt the procession, He cut backward at the nearest pair of bare legs. If his squad sought to stimulate the train to brisker speed, they made general play with their lashes on the limbs and bodies most convenient to them. Thus it was that without words the commands and the desires of the owners were made manifest and obeyed by the newly bought. In any tongue, or lacking any, a rawhide speaks a parable which the dullest wit may comprehend. Of a morning when the Arabs and their yoked commodities still were 10 days from salt water, an adventure and a disaster befell the little caravan. On this day they were moving east by south across a high plateau. We, who have never been there, are accustomed to think of interior Africa as one great jungle, dark, miasmic, knotted with poisonous tropic growths. But here stretched a vast upland plain, lying some thousands of feet above sea level. It was clothed in a rich pasturage through which game trails crossed and crisscrossed, like the wrinkles in the palm of a washwoman's hand. It was parked with fine trees in an effect of studied and ordained landscaping. It was fairly well watered, and it literally rippled with game, both great and small, birds and beasts and some reptiles, grass-eaters and flesh-eaters and bug-eaters, wild animals, and not so very wild either, some of them, abounded in a plenitude which those of us who know only the temperate zones are accustomed to associate with our ideas of insect life in midsummer, but not with four-legged or two-legged creatures. Where the antelope and zebra fed, they filled the scope of the eye, multiplying themselves by thousands and uncountable thousands. When taking panic from real or fancied dangers, they fled to other grazing grounds. They streaked away interminably in a suggestion of driven rains slanting across the earth, and the noise of their hoofs made suitable thunder for the living storm burst that they were. At a point where the herbage grew rank and high, a bull rhino charged the travelers. There were no elephants in this part. Here the rhino was the largest of all the brutes, as indeed, next to only the elephant, he is the largest quadruped to be found anywhere in the world, and for his bulk and his swiftness and his malignant disposition, almost the most dreaded and the most dreadful. He may stand 6 feet and more at the shoulder, may, in the instance of a full-grown male specimen, weigh up to 6,000 pounds. The strength of a 3-ton struck, the sheathing of an armored tank, the power and speed of a runaway switch engine, and with all this, the snout of a unicorn, the eyes of a mole, the brain of a very stupid boar pig, but a scent and a hearing as keen as any, and keener than most, and as quick on his feet to check and to pivot as a toe dancer. In the British Protectorate and farther south, toward the tip of the continent, they killed them today up to this size and heft. 100 years ago, way back yonder in 1819, they certainly ran by average no smaller than they run today, and their temperers probably were just as uncertain. A century more or less works no material change in a rhino's mood. His mood, like his shape, has come down unimpaired and substantially unaltered since the day when he emerged, all plated and scaly and dripping from the primordial mists. The rhino which assailed the passing troop was as big as they grew, and as mean-natured. Probably the sound made by the convoy as it drew near him, the pat-pat of naked feet padding upon the hard-trodden path, the clangor of all that jouncing metalware, perhaps the crack of a well-aimed whiplash, and the agonized screech of its mark as his flesh flinched and wheeled under the stroke, was an irritation to him. From Cummings and Speke on down to this present time, the game hunters have told us that about the sulky bull rhino you can never be sure. He may take it into his horned and leathery head to run away from a single stalker, or, in a sudden fit of purblind rage, may elect to attack a whole safari. But whatsoever he takes it into his head to do, that he does, bulging straight ahead at a gait which is incredibly fast for a thing so lumbersome, and, while at rest, apparently so awkward. Forward on he rushes, an irresistible, crushing, ripping, rending projectile, vicious, fearless, devilish, seeming more a machine than a mammal, more the spectacle of a monstrous wound-up mechanism than an affair of blood and bones. It was so with this particular rhino, which on this particular bygone time charged down upon the slave squad. He heaved himself up into sight from a trampled wallow some 200 yards distant, as the left-hand side of the trail, just as these invaders on the privacy of his bedchamber were abreast of him. He squealed once or twice, sniffed at the taint in the air, and then lowering his front until the slobbery lower lip almost touched the earth, he came at right angles, thundering down upon the travelers, uttering sharp, furious snorts that were like the blasts of a steam whistle as he came. For the Arabs, the tooted danger signal was ample. They scattered, leaping spraddle-legged into the high grass and making for some trees which rose nearby. From personal experience and from hearsay, they knew that once they cleared out of the direct way of the brute, he probably would not swerve from his course to pursue a single fugitive, unless possibly the wind, blowing from one of them to him, informed his nose of what his poor eyes could not tell him. Even so, they veered off frantically toward the trees, with intent to climb them. Brief as the time was, the slaves likewise had full warning of what was upon them. All in a frenzied half-minute or so, they did many futile, purposeless things. They gibbered and shrieked, they fought at their fetters, they dragged the line out to its full length, trying all of them to flee from the point of greatest peril. They huddled in together next, tangling themselves in the chain, then once more swung away from the common center, so that for an instant there was presented this tragic grotesquerie. It was like a figment from a nightmare of 10 joined black shapes straining to move in one direction and 10 more striving to move in the opposite direction, but each batch, by its own crazed efforts, defeating the intent of the other, and in between, as the connecting link for this foolish and antic tug-of-war, a dancing and dangling puppet figure of a black man, his head half twisted off his shoulders, his distorted body writhing and capering, his toes lifted bodily off the earth, his eyes bulging from his skull as he glared full face upon the misshapen deadly mass which bore him down. The rhino struck this fairest of all possible targets, a perfect bull's-eye, impaling it on the longer of his two horns. For an instant the Arabs, looking back from among the tree trunks, beheld an even more fantastical japery than the one of a moment before. In the middle space of their vision they saw the armed prow of the beast, with the spitted wretch held high up on the great head which now was upraised, and from this clumped apex there stretched out to right and left a slanted, rigid V formation, a prong 40 feet long from tip to tip, formed on either plane of naked forms, 10 this side and 10 that, regularly spaced apart, the necks lengthened inordinately, the heads aiming all the same way, the poised, taut bodies pulled straight out behind, the arms set and trailing aft, the legs drawn back horizontally, and kept so by the might which had lifted and now carried them forward. For all the world like a wedge of black geese, in ordered geometric flight, along the flanks of a swift craft that had shoved her bow into their alignment. For the briefest of timeable spaces, this triangled phenomenon endured. Then the hurtling phalanx lost shape, flapped down, folded in on itself, and collapsed in the grass when the rhino, freeing his head of that which cumbered it, whirled about to slash and trample the confused litter underfoot, and then was gone from sight, puffing out the last of his vented spleen as he vanished. Cautiously the dispersed Arabs tracked back to the trail. The damage to them in property values was greater than they feared it would be. Indeed, the loss well nigh was a total loss. The middle slave practically was in bits. His breast was little more than a great hole, and where the gross brute, turning back, had side-swiped at him, the flesh was sheared away from his ribs like fillets from a dressed cod. Some such casualty as this they had expected, naturally, but from this chief victim's chainmates they found the life gone also. No hangman's noose ever had cracked a single spine more expeditiously than those iron necklets under that terrific jolt had cracked the spines of the hapless bondsmen. Broken-necked, they lay in the coil of their own heaped bodies. At first look it seemed the entire 21 were dead, but as it turned out there was an item for possible reclamation. A slave whose station had been at the extreme rear of the string was found to be breathing. His chest was battered and his chin torn, and his shoulders were all rowelled by the tough grass blades through which he had been ploughed and dragged, but his neck lay straight in its collar band, not twisted about as were the necks of the 20. and soon he groaned and moved and threshed with his body. His escape from the common fate might reasonably be accounted for, by virtue of his having been at the tail end of the tether. The colliding jerk which killed the rest had come to him from one way only, from in front. Also, the instant following the impact, there had been no pendant weight of dragged forms behind him to help snap his vertebrae for him. Moreover, just before the rhino struck, he either had the wit to seize the chain in his two hands and hold it fast, with a few precious inches of slack between him and his grip, or else involuntarily he had done this. At any rate, it had been his salvation. His fingers still were cramped in the links. Under prodding, he presently sat up. He hardly seemed worth saving, though. He was idiotic from fright. He continued to tug at his coupling, trying to drag himself farther from the dead pile which anchored him. In his blubbering, bubbly speech, repeatedly he shrieked out words which the Arabs took to be his name for a bull rhinoceros. Nevertheless, they elected to take him along with them. Better a scrap of salvage than the calamity than none at all. By a species of butcher's work which need not here be described, but it was done with knives and spear blades, they redeemed their hampered ironmongery, and they lashed the jarred imbecile to his feet and resumed the interrupted trek, going now 7 all told, where before there had been 27. Since they traveled light, they also traveled fast. That night they overtook at its camping place a larger convoy under the command of their sheikh and accompanied by a Portuguese factor. Having told their story, they incorporated their remaining chattel with the main stock and drove him on down to Mombasa. There a dhow took him and his new companions aboard and carried them to an appointed rendezvous offshore. Being young and able-bodied and in good case, save for his abiding fright, he was bartered at current rates to a lanky Yankee skipper, who at home in the state of Maine was a church deacon and a citizen walking in most mindful ways. Changed now at wrist and ankle instead of neckwise, the solitary survivor of the rhino's pettishness was stowed with sundry hundreds of his kind in the 'tween decks of a smart, fast American-built clipper ship. This being done, Captain Hosea Plummer and his crew of good men and true had up the mudhook and headed away for a far distant place of entry on the soil of their own, their native land of freedom. The middle voyage, as they called it then, was without mishap, and with no more than the average percentage of mortality among the live freightage. Having successfully eluded the British and the American men of war, which popularly were supposed to keep watch for such as he, the master in due time dropped anchor in a certain estuary well sheltered behind a certain island lying between Charleston and Savannah. Here he smuggled ashore his cargo, or what part of it had lived out the trip, and then, having dealt for cash with his consignees and with a fine jag of money in his pockets, went up the coast to the godly down-east town of Portland for a period of vacation and sober thanksgiving. For mind you, Captain Hosea Plummer was not only a pious soul, but was a grateful one. In the year 1920, Mr. G. Claiborne Brissot was living the life of a gentleman in retirement near Smithtown, Long Island. He was known to be by birth Southerner, but he spoke with scarcely a trace of Southern accent. Judging by his speaking voice, you would have said he came from some cultured New England stock. Only when he spoke rapidly or under stress did there slur into his tone a suggestion, a trace, as a chemist might say, of the softening of the consonant R and the slovenly treatment of the final G. This, though, might easily be accounted for. It would appear that in his early youth he had been sent north to be educated. Up here he had been tutored. Later he went through Harvard, and thereafter remained in the North, living first for a while in New York City, and now on this estate which he owned north of Smithtown Village, on a site half a mile back from the Sound. He seemed to have no ties in the section where he had been born. He never visited the South, although his wealth, which was considerable, had been created there, and he rarely spoke of it. Nor did he make mention, ever, of any kinspeople, living or dead, that he might have down there. He did not belong to the Southern Society in New York, or to any of the state societies. It was almost inevitable that as a child he must have had black playfellows, or at least a black nurse. But in his household staff there were no Negroes whatsoever. a rather unusual thing when you remember that most transplanted Southerners like to have colored domestics about them. His valet was a Frenchman, his cook an Armenian. Mr. Brosseau liked his foods highly spiced and well-oiled. His chauffeur, a second-generation Italian. His head gardener, a Scot. And his maidservants usually were Irish girls or Swedish. He lived very much to himself. Really, you might call him a recluse. When he traveled alone, excepting that he took along his valet and occasionally his chauffeur. I meant to say that he had no traveling companion of his own sort. He knew Europe thoroughly, and especially southern Europe, where he had motored extensively, but of his own country all he now saw was a narrow strip along the eastern seaboard. As a young man he had married, but it would appear that within a year or two after his marriage he and his wife, who was since dead, had separated, and thereafter had lived apart. There had been one child, and according to a more or less vague hearsay, the child still lived, although the father was not known ever to have spoken of it. By one report, the child had been born with a deformity on it, or a blemish of some sort, and had been put away elsewhere by the father. This was only gossip. Proofs to back it were lacking. Mr. Brosseau was not a member of any club. Apparently he had no intimate, no confidant whatsoever, unless his lawyer in New York, Mr. Cyrus H. Tyree, might be termed such. The acquaintance he has with his neighbors on Long Island, many of them persons of refinement and property, was little more than a bowing acquaintance. Not one, speaking with truth, could say he was a friend to this reserved and secluded gentleman. For such associates as he had, he mainly preferred foreigners, and notably Frenchmen. Once in a while he had some visiting foreigner for his guest. Otherwise he did no entertaining, accepting very few invitations and extending practically none at all. Perhaps the typical educated Frenchman's tolerance, his racial freedom from so many of the prejudices which bind so many of us, perhaps these appealed to him. Or perhaps his preference might be explained on the ground, since he had a French name, and presumably was, on one side at least, of Latin descent, that some handed-down sentiment in his nature inclined him to seek the company of men of a Latin strain. He loved music, being himself a fair pianist, and better than a fair singer. In his singing and in his playing, invariably he favored French and German and Italian music. For our native folk songs and for our more ambitious work, he seemed not to care at all. As for the rest, he was a plump man of middle age and medium height, with straight dark hair, rather sensitive features, brooding brown eyes, and an aloof, almost a shrinking manner. It was as though, having a distinct personality of his own, he nevertheless strove to subdue it, to hide it away from people, as he hid himself away. Always he wore plain, dark, well-cut garb, but always, too, he wore a bright-colored necktie, and on his fingers heavy jeweled rings, and these, stipplings of florid color taken with his otherwise somber garments and his air, seemed oddly out of place. Naturally, Mr. Brosseau was an object of interest to his neighbors. People discussed him in the terms of a mild and restrained curiosity. They wondered about him. Some probably built up mythical and more or less fantastic theories of their own to account for him and his ways. So there was a distinct stir of polite surprise one afternoon when he came to an amateur race meet on a private half-mile tract at the Blackburn estate, which adjoined his own. Staying at the Blackburn place at this time was Judge Martin Sylvester, who before his elevation to the federal bench had been a member of the lower house of Congress, and before that lieutenant general of one of the South Atlantic states. That same night, meaning by that the night following the racing, Mr. George Blackburn sat with his distinguished visitor on the terrace of the house overlooking the Sound. It was after midnight. The other members of the household had gone off to bed. The two men, both of them elderly, were having the last of the last smoke before they turned in. There befell between them one of those small silences which come sometimes when a pair of men in excellent accord with each other and reasonably well content smoke good cigars together. It was the guest who broke the spell of it. "Blackburn," he said, "what's the greatest tragedy, almost, that our American civilization has to offer?" Without pausing, he went on, answering his own question. "I'm going to tell you what I think it is. I think that about the cruelest tragedy we've got in this country today is the man with a tincture of Negro blood in his veins. The infinitesimal trace which, according to our laws of consanguinity, nevertheless brands him a Negro. and who still has education, good taste, refinement, even may have in him an artist or a creator. But in our national scheme of things, north or south, there is no place for him at all. Life must be hell for such a man. It's bound to be. Think of it. He goes through his days despising his enforced contact with the run of his own race, the race to which we arbitrarily, and as I hold properly, assign him, and yet denied association on equal terms with white people of his own cultural rating. Oh, yes, yes, I know you northerners sometimes make a pretense of according him companionship of a sort. But it's only a pretense, a shadow, and not the substance of the social equality for which he must crave, world without end. Mind you, I'm not arguing in favor of any other convention for treating him. I have the orthodox convictions of an orthodox Southerner. Prejudices, you'd call them, some of them. But even so, I can't help from seeing the pitiable side of it. And the most pitiable part of it is that there's nothing he can do, or you and I can do, or would do, to better things for him. We've got to keep our own stock clean and undefiled, if we can. Got to sacrifice the exceptional individual for the sake of ourselves and our race. One drop of black ink in a pint of clear water discolors the whole cupful. The stain goes all the way through from top to bottom. That's true in chemistry. It's true in biology. True of all creation and all procreation. And you can't get away from it. You can't buck against the everlasting laws. You're only a fool and a criminal if you try. But that don't keep you from being sorry sometimes, does it? I can think of just one other tragedy to equal it, and a kindred tragedy this is, and maybe it's a greater one. And that's the case of a man who, let us say, has in him only a 16th or a 32nd or even a 64th degree of the negroid admixture, a man who passes for a pure Caucasian, who goes unsuspected, and yet must go always with a curse hanging over him, the curse of the fear that someday, somehow, somewhere, some word from him, some involuntary spasmodic act of his, some throwback manifestation of motive or thought that's been hiding in his breed for generation after generation, will betray his secret and utterly undo him. Call it by what scientific jargon or popular term you please, hereditary instinct, reversion to type, transmitted impulse, dormant primitivism, elemental recurrence. Still, the haunting dread of it must be walking with him in every waking minute. It must be there always, poisoning his private thoughts and warping his nature. Ugh. Say, Judge, asked Blackburn, conceding that all you say is true, and I guess it is, every word, what on earth set you off at this unhappy tangent upon such a night as this? Oh, I don't know, said the Southerner. He laughed a cryptic little laugh. The moonlight, I reckon. It's a sort of moon which Private John Allen of Mississippi liked to say we used to have down south before the war. It set me to thinking of things I've seen and heard down in my country. Distressing things, mainly. Now, I remember once... He broke off, considering his shriveled peak of cigar ash, as though this were a thing immensely important. Presently he spoke again, making his tone casual. Blackburn, this next-door neighbor of yours, this Mr. Brosseau, who was over here this afternoon for a little while, he interested me. You must have, judging by the questions you've been asking about him ever since he left. Well, there's not much I can tell you that I haven't already told you, and that's precious little. Brosseau is by way of being our one small neighborhood mystery. He's a puzzle to you, I take it. Well, I'm not surprised at that. He's been a puzzle to us these last 4 years or 5 years since he moved in. Yes, said the judge. He is a puzzle. Or at any rate, I'd say he was a rarity. I only saw him for a few minutes. Only talked with him a few minutes, I mean. But I've had him on my mind ever since. There were certain things about the man. Again he left a sentence unfinished before it was well begun. For his next words he lowered his voice, and before uttering them glanced behind him as though to make sure no servant was within hearing. Blackburn, I may as well get it off my chest. But remember, what I'm going to say is said in the strictest confidence, on the square. He stressed the last word with a special intonation. I get you, said his host, putting the same ritualistic emphasis into his answer. We're in lodge, the door's locked, and the Tyler on guard. But why all this secrecy? Because lacking proof, I commit an indiscretion when I even hint at what's been working inside my brain. It's the sort of thing that a man down my way doesn't even whisper, unless he's prepared in case of a showdown to back up his insinuation with sworn evidence or a gun, or both. Even then, compassion might make him hesitate. But that's enough for a preamble. I reckon we understand each other. Now this Mr. Brissot, while we were being introduced, I felt sort of drawn to him. Some way, in all that big crowd of fine, clever, kindly people, he seemed so terribly alone. And when you happened to mention that he was also from the South, I decided right off that at least we'd have one congenial topic to talk over together, one thing in common. But as it turned out, we didn't. Because when I spoke of families and said I had a sister-in-law whose mother had been a Claiborne, you remember you called him by his full name in introducing us, he shied away from the subject like a galled colt that had been flicked on a raw place. And he didn't have any state pride about him either, not a particle. And that's a blamed peculiar thing, too, in a Southerner born. To have been born in certain states of this Union is an incident, but to have been born in certain others is, to the man who was born there, a profession. Take a man, let's say, from Ohio. Unless he happens to be a Republican candidate for president, he makes no capital out of the circumstance that his parents chose to set up housekeeping in Ohio instead of Illinois or Iowa or Michigan. Ask him where he was born, and he says Ohio, like that, and lets it go at that. But it's apt to be different with a man who hailed originally from Indiana or with one from California. Being a native son is a thing for him to advertise, and to a degree the same thing applies up here in the North to a Massachusetts man, if he came from Boston, or to a Philadelphian, or to one of your old Knickerbocker line in New York. As for the South, well, go anywhere below Mason and Dixon's line and see what happens, especially if you take a Virginian or a Marylander or a Kentuckian or a Louisiana man or a Carolinian, above all a South Carolinian. He may be modest enough in most regards, but just mention his home state, and he'll start bragging as though a special virtue resided in it, and a special virtue in him for having had the forethought and the good taste to have been born there. He never forgets it, and he's not likely to let you forget it either. 99 times out of 100, family means a lot to him. Probably he had a Confederate daddy, or a Revolutionary great-granddaddy that he's proud of. Or maybe an ambassador for a cousin, or somebody for a great-uncle who was in Buchanan's cabinet. I know how it is because I'm a victim of the habit myself. I come from a stock that boasts the loudest. One of my grandfathers came from Richmond, and my mother was a Charleston woman, born in one of those old houses down on the Battery, a house that has been in her family for more than 100 years. See, there I'm beginning to take credit to myself for my forebears, even while I'm describing how the other fellow behaves. It's in us. We just naturally can't get away from it. But your hermit friend over here next door, why, he actually flinched when I tried to talk family with him. And yet, if his name counts for anything, he's of that old Huguenot stock down there in the Tidewater country, who are vainer even as a rule than the rest of us are. Funny. Very funny. It's as though he had something to conceal. As if... Well, what would you say about it yourself? But surely, just because of that, you wouldn't suspect the other thing, said Blackburn. The man is sallow, I admit. Dark-skinned, in fact, but that has nothing to do with it, said Judge Sylvester. In my time, I've known 100 men of the so-called Nordic strain, clean-bred Anglo-Saxon or straight Celtic, who were darker by 10 shades than he is. I'm right smart of a brunette myself, if it comes to that, or anyhow I used to be, before my hair turned white. And his fingernails would pass muster. I looked closely at them, and the little half-moons at their bases were as clear as yours or as mine. No suggestion there of the telltale dark blush that's like a bruise. Nor any chalk, as we say, in his eyeballs, either. They had the right bluish-white cast, But as he turned away from me, I was studying him closely. I don't know why, but I was. There suddenly came into his face, as I saw it in profile, a sort of, well, I won't say a cast. I don't know how to put it in words, but a something or other, as if another face under the skin were fitting itself into the contour of his face. A face that, oh, thunder, I can't express it, and yet I sensed it, felt it, recognized it intuitively. I don't want to be morbid, just to satisfy my own curiosity. I'd certainly like to have a look at the man stripped. Why stripped of all things? I'll tell you why. It's the final test for the negroid smudge. Or at least that's what the people down in my country all firmly believe. I don't know what ethnologists would say about it, but we believe that if a human being has in him the smallest possible tincture of African blood, it will reveal itself in a sort of stain or streak or smear right down the middle of his back. The eyes, the nails, the arches of the insteps, they may all be as Caucasian as George Washington's were, or Lord Byron's. But along the line of the spine, thicker and darker at the base of the column, and growing fainter and lighter as the vertebrae grow smaller at the top, where the nape is, will run that faint, unmistakable smear that's like the stroke of a tar brush. Like a stroke of the tar brush, to put it brutally. I repeat, I don't want to be morbid, Blackburn, but I surely would like to have a look at your neighbor's spine. Mind you, though, no living soul is ever to know what I've just said. Maybe I'm wrong. The Lord knows I hope I am. But of course Judge Sylvester never had his curious wish. 2 days later he finished out his visit and went back to his home near Augusta. And 2 weeks later, to the day, Mr. Brosseau was dead at a grade crossing of the Long Island Railroad after an electric locomotive ran into his automobile. He instantly was killed, and so was his chauffeur. The third occupant of the car was the famous explorer and big game hunter, Colonel Batefarnaro, who had licked the desert and bested the jungle only by this ironic trick of destiny to be smashed up while riding on a paved avenue through a modern real estate development in a suburban addition to one of Greater New York's outlying suburbs. This noted man, who was English by birth and of mixed English and Italian ancestry, had been staying a couple of days with his friend, Mr. Brosseau. The two men had known each other abroad, and when the colonel came over here to lecture, Mr. Brosseau invited him down to his place for a quiet weekend in the country before the beginning of the tour. On a Monday morning they started back for town in Brosseau's closed car, bringing with them the visitors' luggage. Being mainly British, the colonel might travel across Tibet with a toothbrush for equipment, if he had to. But by the same token he could not bring himself to go Friday to Monday without taking along at least one very large, very English-looking kit bag and a suitcase or so. Where the collision occurred, one of the electrified branches of the railway bisected the high road at acute angles. The junction, for the moment, and for some reason or other, was untended. There were no guard gates, and the watchman was away from his post. It was a bad time, as it proved, for him to be absent from his duties, for a high-powered locomotive was moving west at high speed, carrying a single flat with an emergency crew aboard and bound for the scene of a small freight derailment a few miles farther down the line. Word of the tie-up had been flashed to division headquarters a few minutes earlier. The engineer of the wrecker had orders to make time, for traffic temporarily was tied up, and he was making it, giving his motor all the juice she would take. 200 yards distant, the locomotive tore out of a shallow cut into view of the crossing just as the Brosseau car came up a slight elevation approaching the right-of-way. The engineer did what he could, which was mighty little. Seeing he could not materially check his gait in so short a distance, he sounded his whistle in warning, and he shut off his power and braked down hard. The chauffeur did his best too, but it would seem the trouble with him, a fatal trouble as it turned out, was that in the imminent and impending face of the whizzing menace which so suddenly had come upon him, he altogether lost his head. Subsequent inquiry tended to develop the fact, or rather the theory, that first he tried to get over the track before the onrushing locomotive reached there, and that he changed his mind and tried to halt his car on the nearer side, and that the upshot was he killed his motor. Be that as it may, the outstanding circumstance was this: the automobile at a dead stop stood squarely straddling the rails for an appreciable period of time before the squatty locomotive, bleating in sharp staccato blasts, struck it broadside, and flung it 60 feet in a scrap heap of crumpled metal and broken parts. Mr. Brusseau and Luigi, his chauffeur, were both of them dead when they were picked up. The latter terribly was mutilated. He was scroted like a fish where he had been hurled through his windshield. By some freak of physics or of fate, Colonel Bate Farnaro had been spared his life. He had a broken leg, though, and several of his ribs were caved in. He was carried unconscious to Jamaica and thence to a hospital in the city. At first it was feared his skull might be fractured. As it proved, he was suffering from a considerable concussion of the brain. That mainly was what kept him unconscious for so long. It was 2 days later when he came to his senses, and a day after that before the surgeons allowed him to see visitors. The first to see him, then, was the late Mr. Brusseau's lawyer, Mr. Cyrus Tyree, had come hurrying from town immediately on hearing of the lamentable thing that had happened. He had returned that night and had been waiting ever since for this opportunity to get from the injured Englishman his version of the affair. Mr. Tyree anticipated, since Colonel Bate Farnaro was an adventure-seeker of acknowledged repute, and therefore probably accustomed to tragedy and quick danger, that the latter had kept his head, and should be able to give a reasonably coherent account of what passed in those few dreadful seconds between the appearance of the wrecker and its collision with the stalled automobile. Nor was the lawyer disappointed in this hope, but almost the first extended remark by the bandaged-up Englishman after Mr. Tyree had been presented to him and the nurse had left the room seemed profoundly to disturb the caller. Ever since I got my wits back, I've been lying here puzzling over a most extraordinary circumstance connected with this distressing occurrence, said the individual. In the midst of my regret for the shocking death of my host and my reflections on my own close squeak, I've not been able to put it out of my mind. Poor dead Brusseau, God rest him, always struck me as being a remarkably closed-mouthed person, not in the least given to idle talk about this and that, I mean to say. But why he should have been so secretive regarding his African experiences, I mean to say, why to me, of all persons, he should have been so secretive, well... Pardon me, interrupted Mr. Tyree in a suddenly concerned way. Did you say his African experiences? Yes. The Britisher moved his swathed head impatiently. He had knowledge, naturally, of the years I'd spent in interior Africa. If only he'd chosen to tell me that he'd been there too, we'd have had something in common, something that would have been most confoundedly interesting for both of us to talk about. But Mr. Brusseau was never in Africa, said Mr. Tyree, still in that strained tone. I can positively assure you of that. My dear sir, I can't possibly be mistaken. The colonel spoke emphatically. I can only repeat that you must be mistaken, stated Mr. Tyree gravely. My late client had traveled extensively, as you probably know, but he never visited Africa. There were reasons why, of all the places in the world, he would never have gone. He broke off and started afresh. I give you my word of honor, Colonel, that Claiborne Brusseau never in his life set foot on African soil. Your pardon again, my dear fellow, but surely you are the one who is wrong. We practically are strangers. Even so, I assume that as Brusseau's solicitor, and presumably as his friend, you enjoyed his confidence. I did, to a greater extent than any living being did. Well then, in that case, there was a chapter in his life he could not have told you of. I may be a bit knocked about, and I confess to a nasty headache, but in view of past experiences I myself have had, there are certain matters regarding which I could not possibly be deceived. Why, from my recollection of that horrid disaster on Monday, there stands out above all the rest of the details a certain phase of it which absolutely convinced me of this. Brusseau, at some time or another, must have had intimate acquaintance with the African wildlife, with the language of a certain very remote tribe, with matters that one could learn only at first hand, out there, on the spot. Mr. Tyree bent forward where he sat alongside the bed. There was a curious, intent look, almost a startled look, on his face, and his eyelids lowered until his eyes were mere slits. Colonel, he said, would you please tell me in detail exactly what happened, with particular reference to these disclosures which you say aroused your suspicion? There isn't much to tell. There we were, and yonder was that cursed engine coming down upon us. Here I sat, penned up in that confounded coop of a car, and here just alongside me was Brissot, and there, just directly in front of us, was the chauffeur, who all at once seemed to have gone quite mad from fright, and was screaming out most horribly. You see, we all three of us had sufficient time for apprehending what was about to happen. In a time like that, things may pass in a flash, but you see them all, and if you live through it, you remember them afterwards. We even had opportunity for making a move to get out of the car. I don't say we could have succeeded, any of us, but at least there was an appreciable time for trying. No use, though. The chauffeur seemed to be entangled in his steering wheel. Quite a stoutish chap he was, with a snug fit for his seat, I should say. And the car door on my side of the car was caught. We'd noticed that morning, before we left Brissot's place, that the running board upon the other side, my luggage had been piled upon the other side, the side from which the locomotive was coming. My luggage had been piled up and tied on after we got in. So there we were, you see, all three of us, practically prisoners, and quite helpless. Poor Brissot did his best. He seized the door handle on his side, and he turned it and tried to shove his way out. But his head was all he succeeded in getting entirely out. I figure my larger kit bag, it was quite heavy really, must have slumped down or slipped forward in some way just at that instant. Possibly his sudden push of the door shifted it, for the door was forced directly back again, pinching Brissot by the throat so that he was stuck fast, as though his neck were locked in a vice. And there he stayed, poor chap, like one set in a pillory, unable to move either way, and directly facing his doom until the blow came. I recall the entire thing very clearly, even though it all happened in much less time than I require now to tell you of it. It was as though I had one eye for Brissot's hideous plight, and one for the chauffeur's state, and an extra one for watching that engine approach, and for calculating by its speed how long it would be before we were struck. Somehow my interest in myself was semi-detached, as you might say. I'd made up my mind already that I, for one, had no earthly chance to escape. I've noticed the same thing before in emergencies that might be called comparable to this one. One with the Cape Buffalo, when my gun-bearer deserted me after I'd fired and missed, and once again in a bit of a mess with a wounded tiger out in India. And it was just then, at that precise moment, while poor Brissot's head was held so tightly that he cried out the words which made me know he had been where, in my time, I have been, up away the interior, well on toward the Uganda district. As he uttered them, I too, in spite of all else, was struck by the same paralleling fact, which, through some abnormal, spasmodic trick of memory, must have driven itself then and there right into his brain. It was a curious freak. Probably one of these psychological sharps could explain it, I can't. I only know that I also was impressed, even in the one brief instant and under those circumstances, by the graphic resemblance which the locomotive, rushing straight at us, snorting and grinding and tooting, bore to a bull rhino charging, as the brute always does, with his head down and his belly hugging the earth. Do you actually mean to say he called out the word rhinoceros? Yes and no. The thing was more remarkable even than if he had used the English word, when what he shrieked rather, was a phrase of two native words. The very looks of that approaching monster must vividly have brought those words back to him now, years and years perhaps after he first heard them, no doubt under somewhat similar circumstances. He cried out not once, but 3 times, "Nyamatumba, Nyamatumba, Nyamatumba," just so. And that is from the language of the Mbama, a tribe now almost extinct, who live beyond the country of the Maasai, on the inner side of our British protectorate in what was formerly Portuguese East Africa. There are only a few of them left. The slave trade first, and the white man's diseases afterwards, long ago decimated them. The words literally translated mean great animal, and that's the Mbama's only name for the bull rhino. Extraordinary coincidence, I call it, if one may speak in such a sense of such a thing being coincidence. Mr. Tyree made no answer. For a bit he sat like a man stunned by an incredible tale of an incredible manifestation.